Hi, good evening, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the show about mental health and addictions. My name is Nels Kloster. I'm an addiction psychiatrist working in southern Vermont.
And my name is Robert Stack. I'm a licensed alcohol and drug counselor, licensed mental health counselor. And first of all, I want to say what a great show we had last week at Mary Ellen Copeland, and it was just really went well.
Yeah, that was very nice. I mean, she talked about people taking charge of their own mental health, talked about a sense of connectedness to community. I really enjoyed having her on the show.
And we should have more experts on. But for tonight, it's just us.
Right.
And I have to say, I mean, one of the things that we wanted to talk about was spirituality. And this really makes us nervous because, you know, normally if you're going to talk about spirituality, you bring on the expert, you bring on a rabbi, a minister, a priest, or somebody. And what we're going to try and do is just talk about it in the context of just like laypersons. I mean, how do you understand spirituality? I mean, and how do you use it in recovery from addiction and mental health? And so I think, you know, one of the things I did was I went around and I asked people, you know, tell me what your thoughts are. And one of the first things I ran across was that people really had a hard time with the words. They don't like the word God, or they as soon as you say God, they get nervous. Or
religion has a certain set of meanings to it.
Almost automatically, you'll hear some people say, well, I have a spiritual life, but not a religious life. They want to remove that. And I also found sort of almost a reluctance to talk about it. Now, I know you have some statistics, and it says that a lot of people believe in God.
Yeah.
But it's almost, sometimes get a sense of embarrassment almost. I'm not quite sure what that's about. I mean, it's sort of I know for me at one point in my life, I almost felt like to have a spiritual life or to believe in spirituality was to, I don't know, like it wasn't intelligent. Like it wasn't smart,
yeah,
you know what I mean? Like, you know, like if you're smart, you can't really believe in God, or you can't, you know. And I think that was like a major stumbling block to me. And I read someplace where they talked about intellectual pride, and I think that I had. So anyway, so for the interest of the rest of the time that we talk, I guess I would like to say that one of my ways that I understand spirituality, and there's two ways that I think about it. One is that if you've ever seen somebody die, one moment they're alive, they're breathing, and the next second or so, a minute, they're gone. There's nobody there. Their body is there, the face is there, everything is there, but there's something missing. And you could say that it's electricity or whatever it might be, but I think it's the life force. And I often think of that as one spirit. And I tend to think that, you know, our spiritual life is not our intellectual life, and it's not our physical life. It's like the third piece of it. And it has to do with our capacity to love. It has to do with our capacity of our sense of well-being, our sense of that you're not in this all alone. I don't know how else to say that, but I mean, so that's really how I tend to think about it. When I think of the spirit, you can use the word soul if you're comfortable, but as soon as you do that, I think some people get a little nervous about it. But that is how I understand it. I think it's, and you've heard me say this, but it's, you know, if somebody said they were heartbroken, they wouldn't really mean that their heart, which is a muscle, is broken. I mean, their heart, that's a heart attack. And what they really mean is that there's some pain inside that has to do with love, with connection to another person or something else that's important to them. So I tend to think about that. Like when I think about someone who's depressed and really in rough shape, I mean, I tend to think someone who has no hope or no belief in something. I tend to think that that's spiritual. Now, I know that there's other ways of thinking about it, but that's sort of how I think about it. And I think as we go through this half hour talking about it, I would like people, you know, to suspend their disbelief, if you will, or to suspend their sort of, oh, I can't believe in that stuff, and just listen to it like with an open mind, and try and think about if it was up to you to figure out a way to use spirituality to have a better life, what would it be, and how would you do it?
Yeah. And I mean, it has an impact on our wellness too, both physically and mentally. But it really intrigued me to talk about the idea of feeling like you were too smart to kind of have a set of beliefs like that. And I'm pretty sure it's just one of those kind kind of urban myths or legends, but supposedly there was a conversation with Carl Sagan and another, well-respected scientist, and I can't remember who said what, but I think it was, Carl Sagan saying, supposedly the other scientist, well, you're so smart. How is it you believe in, and I guess it was Christian, how do you believe in God? And the other guy supposedly answered back, well, you're so smart, how do you not believe? And I think, too, that we know sort of like Albert Einstein, probably one of the most notable scientists of all times, very much had a set of sort of beliefs or spirituality that he, often talked about. And sort of getting back to the more ordinary, I'm thinking back to being raised kind of Lutheran and being sent to catechism for 2 years to learn what you're supposed to learn there. And our minister was very big on sort of the idea of wrestling with this. These are very important ideas, and they shouldn't just be accepted blindly, that you really should think about it and feel it. And what he often talked about, and I'm not sure if it's necessarily a Lutheran tradition, is the leap of faith, that you can't come to this by intellect alone. So just thinking about it, just being smart, that doesn't necessarily bring you towards any faith or any spirituality. There's something about this, like you're saying, it's a matter of the heart, it's a matter of the spirit. It's just something that's almost unfathomable, but yet it is so common that we all hold some kind of belief.
And I think, and the other thing is so striking to me, is the comfort that people find in it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, I sometimes, I was born into a religion, and, I was baptized in all the Catholicism, but it never felt like something that was mine. I mean, it was something that I was expected. You go to church, you go to mass, you become that.
That's what your neighbors did, what your family did.
Yeah,
right?
It was a cultural almost. I mean, Irish Catholic, but when I went into the service as I got older, it had less and less meaning in my life. And as a matter of fact, it almost, I don't know. I mean, you can always talk about these things in some weird way, but it's sort of like it wasn't part of my life. And I remember as I got older, like I met people who had developed a spiritual life, and a lot of them had found alternative spirituality, like Buddhism, like they had grown up
almost like a kind of rebellion in your spiritual
well,
beliefs.
yeah,
right?
or almost as if the traditional Judeo-Christian or Protestant, or if you study the religions in America and you realize there was the Unitarians and there were the Baptists and there were
there's a whole menu out here.
That's
of things
right.
I can
And
choose
you
from,
traced
right?
it back that Henry wanted to have another wife. You know what I mean? And it was, or if you wanted to look at because they had 3 popes and there was all this
and all the
stuff.
children of the popes had back in the
right.
Middle Ages.
So I mean,
example,
on some level, I think in a lot of people sort of go, well, the religion is this, and there's all that other problems with it. But I think there is a universal search for that element that people find themselves at peace with themselves. Mm-hmm. People actually experience a sense of self-esteem and self-love and the ability to love others. And I really believe this. I mean, I think, and if you're spiritually fit, in a lot of ways, the rest of the world sort of makes sense. I mean, that's my look.
Well, how else? I think there's a big piece of it too. Is how else do we make sense of the chaos, the unfairness that is out there in the world? If you don't have some sort of sense of something sort of beyond yourself, or something sort of a bigger picture view of the world.
Well, and that's interesting because after the Holocaust, after what happened there. Some people say, well, God is dead, or, it can't possibly be, why wouldn't God intervene and everything? And, and I struggle with that, because I used to think of God as an interventionist. And and again, I don't have the answer. It's funny, as I'm talking to you, I feel like I want to apologize, because I'm talking about things that people don't normally talk about. But the idea is that, I believe, and people can disagree, obviously, but I think part of what man has is free will, and we have a choice about how we live our lives, and there's no value in a virtuous life unless there's a choice not to be, and I think that part of it is the choices that we make in the lives that we live, and one of my challenges when I worked in the hospital, sometimes when I worked with addicts, and I would recommend 12-step programs, and they would say, "Oh, well, that's God. There's some God in there, some spiritual thing." And
I can't do God is the thing I heard the most
I
often.
can't do God, right? Yeah. And but there's 2 things there. I mean, one, I would sort of say, well, these fellowships help people get better. And it's sort of interesting, Nurse on the Unit used to talk about addicts who had the gift of desperation. If you get desperate enough, you try anything. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, I'll try it. And I think that's how I approach some folks. I sort of said, well, look, why don't you give it a try before you decide that it's not helpful? Because I think that's what happens with a lot of people. I mean, especially like with prayer or meditation sometimes. They decide ahead of time that, oh, well, I'm not going to do that. That doesn't work. But they haven't done it.
Right.
And you know what I mean? It's sort of like, you sometimes have to encourage people who say, well, give it a try. See if it's helpful. I mean, I firmly believe in the power of prayer. I pray every day. I don't mind saying that. And I don't think it's like that I pray for things. I don't pray for the lottery. I don't pray for, what I pray for is like the ability to live my life. And, I don't mean that like it's like anything special.
But it doesn't need to be apologized for. It's not It's not unusual. Looking at some, studies and statistics and this sort of thing. Like 95% of Americans believe in God, and 90% of people across the world practice some kind of religious or spiritual observance. And so you can even see it goes way back in history with like Neanderthals sort of 50, 60,000 years ago. And even some evidence goes even farther back, like hundreds of thousands of years ago, that there was evidence that there were sort of spiritual or religious practices around burials. So, finding a grave that had objects in it which was suggestive of a belief that they would take those to an afterlife. That's been around for as long as we can recognize it as a civilization. So there's something about this that some people are suggesting is actually hardwired into us. This has sort of evolved with us, or is really a part of us being whole and being well as human beings.
Right, and there's different ways to experience it. I mean, there's different, and I was sharing before the show, I was doing some research, and I went and read William James and a variety of religious experiences, and I had read it before, and I was looking at it again. And at the very end, he was talking about, and I looked it up, and he was talking about alcohol. And so I was ready to hear, alcohol's bad and alcohol's bad. And he actually said the opposite. He says, alcohol in some ways gives you a taste of a well-being. He says, in the initial stage, everything is good, everything is fine, you feel good about yourself. There's a
taste
relief.
For the divine.
Yeah, and he says it's a taste. And of course, later on, it becomes terrible. It's very destructive. But he says, in a way, I know this to be true. I mean, some of the folks I used to work with, they were so harmed in some ways and didn't feel good about themselves, didn't feel good about their lives. And when they did drugs or when they did alcohol, it was such a sense of relief. It was such a sense of like, they felt good about themselves. They felt it was okay. It didn't matter what else was going on. It was all right. And as long as they could do their drug, life would be okay.
Right, yeah.
And I got to say that when we take the drug away, we still want them to feel good about themselves. We still want them to feel that life will be the way it is, and you have to sort of show up, and it's okay, and you're good enough.
But at that point, their life's gotten worse.
Oh yeah,
from
much
when
worse.
They initially started off. I remember we saw that movie Hungry Heart last week.
Right.
About opiate addiction, mostly prescription addiction up in Franklin County. And what jumped out at me when they were talking in the movie and then with the panel afterwards was the idea of there being a hole, that people felt like they just didn't have a sense of being happy, they didn't have a sense of being connected or belonging, and then once they started on the drugs, like, oh, this is it. This is what I've been missing. And they didn't know that they had this sort of aching in that hole until they took the drugs.
Right.
And felt a relief.
And I think, and I think part of what spirituality does is it fills that hole. I mean, quite frankly, I really believe that, and it doesn't have to. I have a good friend of mine who talks about a horizontal spirituality. And she said, I don't believe in the, vertical one, but I do believe that there is something that we all share, and there is something that we share when we're with people, the fellowship, if you will, or when we're connected in people in meditation, or people who are connected in rituals. Whether it be Mass or whatever it might be, something that they do together. And James made this point repeatedly, but especially at the end of the book. He said, the importance is to believe in something larger than self. Mm-hmm. Something larger than self. And I think I would have added, and it's benevolent. You know what I mean? It's not a negative larger than self.
Right.
It's not evil. It's something that's larger than self that will help you. And, you know, as we got ready to do this show, we talked about how we're going to do it and what's a fair way. And I'm really going to put you on the spot.
Oh, thank you.
That's
Yeah.
right. But what I would like you to do is explain it from a biology, from science.
Sure,
because I
sure.
think it's worth saying.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of worth understanding that there is a biology to this. There is a chemical part of
Yeah.
this.
Oh, absolutely.
Please.
But I want to sort of start off with with the warning that a lot of times people think that when you sort of break things down to the science, whether it's sort of biochemicals or you know, anthropology or social interactions, that actually takes away some of the magic of it. It takes away some of that wonder and makes it rather stale and boring. And that's not the way that most people take it. It's certainly not the way, again, we're referring to Einstein, that's not the way that he referred to it. And I think that most scientists who do this sort of thing, it even sort of increases their awe at just how sort of mystical and amazing this is. So that's my sort of warning ahead of my request for forgiveness before I lost on to this.
Yeah.
But you know, I was fascinated by a book that actually the title was "The God Gene" by a guy, Dean Hammer, who is a genetics researcher with the National Institutes of Health, and based on how this has always been a facet of civilization, it always seems to have been a facet of being human, he started to think, well, maybe this is part of our genetic makeup. That, you know, maybe we could isolate a gene or a set of genes and then sort of measure how this plays itself out and determine that maybe there's a survival benefit here for a species. And one of the measures that he uses is something called the transcendence scale. So you've mentioned that feeling a sense of something bigger than ourselves. And so that's exactly what he was talking about. That, you know, transcendence is a term that showed up in many different places that I was reading before this program, which is that sense of something bigger than yourselves or a oneness with nature. And so he looked at that as sort of a basis for sort of a spiritual sense, and that might be sort of part of how that might be hardwired into us, that we have that sense of that. And looking at sort of ideas about you know, evolution and how we've sort of evolved to be the types of, you know, species that we are now, one of the things is this common across every you know, mammals or reptiles is, one, you have to survive and you have to reproduce. So you don't sort of physical health and mental health have to remain intact, safety, eating, that sort of thing. And sort of finding a mate, protecting a mate, having offspring. But two other pieces with humans is it has to be also sort of what's called you know, association with kin, which, again, so if you look at the way genes are passed on, I care more about my kids than I do my grandchildren. I care more about my kids and grandchildren than I do my cousins, because I share more with them. And there's also the idea then that we have to reciprocate with each other. So that means that you have to know that if you do a favor for me, I'm going to do that favor back for you, whether it's something as you know, like around being neighbors, or if we go back more primitively, you know, if you bring food, do I share my fire with you? And then we know that we can get along this balance, and neither one of us is going to take advantage of the other one. So there's these ways of sort of studying this that makes you think spirituality is a big piece of this, because it has to do with sort of an identity, a set of beliefs, sort of a direction, a sense of something that's larger than ourselves. So as I was reading, it seems that there are a lot of parallels here with the spirituality, with sort of our own evolution, that make them seem like they really go together quite naturally. And then people talk about also sort of then you can get into sort of neurochemicals as well. A sense of love being fostered by this oxytocin. It's when a mother and an infant gaze at each other, she's breastfeeding her newborn, there's a surge of oxytocin in both of them. You see the teenagers as well being more connected themselves with each other than they are with their families and with their parents. And as you look at a sense of mysticism, if you think, again, as maybe not the best example, but looking at the effect of psilocybin, which is an hallucinogen, or the effect of LSD, which is another, you know, better known hallucinogen, that these have great upsurges in serotonin. So there's this idea then too that our nervous system might actually have evolved in such a way that we're prone to these sorts of feelings, these sort of connections with ourselves and with the larger sense. So and that plays a role in depression as well, you know, with low serotonin, low dopamine, low norepinephrine. So it's just I find it intriguing that you can find these neurochemical sort of bases for depression and spirituality and anxiety that really speaks from a sort of scientific point of view, which doesn't sound quite as mystical, that there is, that these things belong together, and part of this being healthy.
I got it, and that's why I asked that we talk about this on some level. I mean, recently I was reading a book called Normal, and it's a doctor who's involved with DSM-4, and now he's being critical of DSM-5, and I hope you get a chance to look at it. But toward the end of the book, he gives some suggestions about what people should do, and he says, you know, you should eat right, you should sleep, you know, get your sleep in, you know, and you know, don't make a big deal of it. It's just life, and we all have our struggles. You know, he had like, you know, and right in the middle of it, like in a paragraph, he goes, you know, and seek spiritual help or something. I mean, it was like 3 words, you know, and then he went on. He went on, you know.
Get help from somebody else.
Yeah,
right?
go ahead, you know, and I think about that. I mean, I think a lot of people recognize it, and I don't. I'm not one to put down religion. I know a lot of people. I mean, they're so easy to do that, but some of them are actually experts in spirituality. I mean, it's worth reading their books. It is. I mean, it's sort of like, you know, and if you were raised in a religion and you can use some of their practices, some of the rituals, or some of the prayers that they use, I mean, go ahead by all means. But I find this a lot, that people sort of believe, like you say, yeah, I believe in God, but it's not part of my life. Like it's like and I read somewhere where they talked about, you know, you can use God as a relief pitcher in the bottom of the ninth. You know what I mean? Like, you know, when all else fails, like, you know, you're in jail and you go, oh, God help me. You know?
Right. Or there are no atheists. No, that expression, no atheists are in foxholes.
Well, whatever, you know, like, well, you know, everybody else has failed, so now let me try this God thing.
Last
you know?
resort, yeah.
But I think, you know, for some people, that belief is real. And what came across to me is that, you know, you want to develop a relationship. So if you had a relationship, it would be different than saying, I only talk to this person when I'm in trouble. When I'm in trouble, I call it. It's like, and that's really made a difference. It's made a difference in my life. I mean, but the idea is that it's an ongoing, and I understand now that what it means to be a seeker, to sort of try and figure this out. Well, what does this mean? Because I've always been interested, like with addiction and alcoholism and mental illness. Like, you know, what's the missing piece? And I know a lot of times people want to tell me about the neurotransmitters, and they want to tell me about the serotonin uptake, and I get that.
It doesn't fascinate you very well, does it?
No, and I know if you take these pills and they increase that, you know, because I still think there's some element to being human that is not just there. It's not just in the brain. And I know, like, real smart people are like, feel sorry for me. But I mean, no, like, I don't. I think there's more to it.
Because some people try to argue that the mind is the brain, that there's so many neurons and possible combinations of firings that that's the mind and the brain are the same thing. It's nothing more than that. And then other people are like, no, it's something more than neurons firing. Yeah. There's something bigger here than just electricity.
And even if it's silliness, I don't care. I mean, because it is very helpful. You know, it's become very real. So it's like, and again, I go back to my work working in the hospital with alcoholics and addicts. You know, and it was almost like a challenge to them. Like they're not there to study theology. You know what I mean? It's like, you know, they had all of a sudden they were confronted with, like, well, what does God mean? You know, or how do you understand God? You know, it's like, I don't understand God.
I don't want to.
You know, how do I do this? Like, oh, I don't know. But it isn't so much like you have to be a PhD in theology. It's almost like you just have to believe in the possibility that you might get some help. It might be helpful to you. I mean, I think that, you know, and you run into this, and I know that people are looking for, like a lot of people look for alternative. They used to say anything but God.
Right.
In other words, I want what AA does, but I don't want the God piece, or I don't want, and I still think it works, because what happens is they end up with fellowship, they end up with a greater purpose, they end up with a different quality of life, if you will, and they try and live a certain way that's beneficial to themselves and others.
I mean, that's just true. There's a sense of well-being, there's a sense of connectedness, a sense of something larger than yourself, and you can see those things described in fellowship like AA. You can see that as part of church, or different spiritual practice, or whether it's just a part of mental health treatment, why that's helpful as well.
I just want to make it a case for it that it's worth looking for. You know what I mean? It's like, please, I understand, but if you're struggling in life, if you're struggling with depression, if you're struggling with alcoholism and drug addiction, don't shut the door to spirituality. I mean, I really think that it is a way to end up feeling better about yourself. It is a way to sort of help yourself find your place. And whether it's Rastafarian, and I know that as soon as I say it, people smoking pot, but I don't care. I mean, and people tell me, well, the Indians did peyote and all.
But it was part of a tradition.
Yeah.
It was part, and I think Leslie Fishelman, who's a good friend of ours, talked about.
Yeah.
There's one thing to take these drugs as a shortcut to spirituality, because it just doesn't last. Whereas if you practice, like you were saying, not just sort of, I'm in need, I'm in danger, let me go to a religion or a spiritual tradition, but it has to be a practice that you over and over again, which implies consistent effort. And that's the way that people seem to find the different sort of a peace or strength in spirituality.
Yeah, and occasionally, there people I have a good friend that says he doesn't know whether or not he believes in God, but he believes in the grace of God, which is an interesting, kind of sideline. But he believes that sometimes you can see the grace in people. You can see the way they're living, and it's almost, for some people, that it's a gift to see it when it happens. And it's a quality of life, it's a quality of themselves, and it comes from, William James said, and he referred to, William James, this is from a lecture in 1905, where he talked about the effect about how people change their lives. And he talked about the conversion effect. And the three things that were necessary was, one, there had to be a calamity had to happen. Something overwhelming had to happen so that someone just felt completely defeated.
Like a crisis.
And they said, I give up, I can't do this. And at that moment, they asked for help. And when those three things were present, you often had what he would call this conversion effect. And it was really a way of sort of feeling better about themselves. It was really, it was when they stopped thinking, I run the world, I don't need anybody else's help, I can be self-sufficient. And then when you hit this crisis and you realize, no, I can't, I need help. And that's often when people appeal for it. But I think if you can work it into your daily life, you don't have to wait till the worst moment of your life. You could work on it on a daily basis.
You could be protected from this happening, because I think what I see often is whether it's the introduction of drugs and addiction, whether it's mental illnesses such as depression or anxiety, that seems to disconnect us from community, from family, and the spirituality could be a means of sort of bringing back that connectedness and that belonging.
We're coming to the end of the show, and I'm a little bit afraid that what I've done is alienate the people who are spiritual by doing such a poor job of it. And I've also made people who don't believe in it just think I'm just crazy. Wasted time.
It's an equal treatment, right?
That's right. I might come away disliked by many.
It's really broad. They belong together. We certainly don't mean to offend anybody, but our wish would be, to offer some kind of help, a way of looking at things, sort of hoping to enrich people's lives with this idea that spirituality can be a very big part of recovery and being well.
And we had considered that, you can talk about all the negatives about people with God and religion and all the bad things about it, but I just as soon not use this time to do that. And I recognize it, and I respect it, and I understand that it's out there, whether it's sex crimes, pedophile, whatever it might be, whatever the problems might be. I'm not making light of it, and I'm not making believe it doesn't exist.
No.
I'm just saying that there is an element to religion of spirituality. There's a part of life that should be acknowledged. And for a lot of people who suffer, that's something that could be useful.
No, it's basically good, and we shouldn't let the small percentage that makes it bad sway us.
Thank you.
So next week we're going to have guests from the Women's Freedom Center, and we're going to tackle the issue of domestic violence and its impact on wellness and recovery.
And believe me, it is something with alcoholism when you look at it and what damage it does to children. If anybody has any comments or questions, please feel free to use our Facebook or our website, whatever it is. Thank you all very much.
Good night.